Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. As we continue our discussion of the Great Depression, in this lecture and the few that follow it, we're going to be talking about living conditions during the Depression and how it is that Americans managed to get by, even in the midst of some of the worst hardship and suffering in our nation's history. As I've mentioned in previous lectures, by 1932, the country had reached the depths of the Great Depression. Between 1929 and 32, one half of the gross national product had disappeared. That is essentially the value of American businesses and products had been cut in half. Many businesses were closing up shop and going under. Many banks, as well as I've described, which had no money in the vault, were forced to close down. By 1932, depending where you were in the country, as much as a third of the population might be unemployed. And many of those who were employed could only get part-time jobs. Homelessness was at an all-time high, as many people could no longer afford to pay their rent or pay the mortgage. Most people had no savings, had no insurance against the Depression. Those who had saved frequently lost everything as the banks closed their doors. And as I've mentioned, the other handful who might have invested in the stock market lost everything they invested as well. At that time, there wasn't any bank insurance or anything like that to protect your savings. We'll talk more about those regulations which were introduced as a result of this crisis. What if you got sick? There was no Blue Cross or Blue Shield. There really was nothing, no safety net. There was no Social Security or welfare. Students at universities often had to drop out. They couldn't afford the tuition or housing or meals. By 1932, the nation was without hope. The bonus army was a sign that the government wasn't going to help. They even turned away their own veterans from World War I. Bessie Smith, the great black singer of that time, put it best in her song, "Nobody knows you when you're down and out. Nobody gives a damn." Whites had their songs too, the most famous of them, "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" There are many signs of the Great Depression in the country, and we'll talk about some more of those in just a moment. But the worst, clearly, is that many Americans died in the midst of this depression. In a country that even at that time was supposedly one of the richest and most well-developed in the world. If we look at the statistic on this screen, in New York City alone, in 1 year, 1931, 95 people died of starvation. One person dying of starvation is too much in the United States. But in this one city, in 1 year, nearly 100 died from starvation. That number multiplied many times over across the whole country and throughout the years of the Great Depression. Many, many people died of starvation. The Depression hit first and hardest in the industrial sectors in the North and Midwest, areas that had boomed during the automobile craze of the 1920s. But it also set in around the rest of the country and even the rest of the world, as we'll discuss in future lectures. Farming communities in the South and West had been accustomed to hard times already, but things only got worse as the Depression set in. White-collar and government jobs suffered less for the most part, but psychological suffering could be extreme. Losing your life savings or your job drove some to commit suicide. I've mentioned unemployment, which was a severe problem, but it wasn't the only problem. I think we under-discuss the issue of partial employment during the Great Depression. This was a serious problem all across the country. What I mean by partial employment is those who might have a job and thus might show up on the employment rolls, but a job that might be beneath their training or might only pay them part of what they were accustomed to. So even those who had jobs might suffer demotions or pay cuts or cuts in hours. And a great many saw their status and income decline, even if they stayed employed. So this is the process whereby doctors and lawyers during the Great Depression might become taxicab drivers. And taxicab drivers might become janitors or street cleaners. And it was the janitors and the street cleaners who finally hit the unemployment rolls. The Depression lasted for over a decade and often took several years to hit people to its full effect. Families milked whatever savings they might have, sold items, conserved, eventually stopped buying new cars or homes, then large appliances, luxury items, and eventually some might sell their homes or downsize. Gradually, perhaps years into the process, they could no longer make their payments and might be shoved off the bottom rung into homelessness. Hoboism was at an all-time high by the early to mid-1930s. Men or families who were homeless, out of work, constantly moving in search of work. Groups of hobos riding the rails on trains were very common. Beggars became a common sight across the country. People who were trying to do something, anything, to preserve a shred of dignity, to somehow keep themselves alive and earn a living during these desperate times, hoping and thinking that things might be better in the next town over, the next city over, or the next state. And yet it rarely was. And so in the midst of the Depression, we have this massive kind of swirling internal migration as thousands and thousands of people moved from one place to another, but with little hope of conditions improving. The Depression also created health problems for people all across the country, and these too tended to develop slowly as the quality and quantity of diet declined all across the country. Weakness and disease increased. This was a sort of slow, creeping, insidious after effect of the Depression. In some ways, we didn't even realize the extent that this was happening until the onset of World War II, at which point the nation set out to develop and create an army. And tens of thousands of men are drafted into the army, called in for their medical examinations for suitability to service. At that point, we realize thousands and thousands of these men are rejected for poor eyesight, weak bones, flat feet, other kinds of ailments, many of which were brought on by the poor diet, limited vitamins, and so on that were brought on by the Great Depression.